Hey everybody, and welcome back to Wednesdays with Watson. If you've been following my journey, by now you know that my name is Amy Watson, and I am your host. I mentioned in our very first episode that this podcast, this first season that we're calling PTSD, Jesus and Me, and I would grow and evolve as the season continued, and that has certainly been true. I am so grateful for this continued opportunity to share such hope with you. Today I am both elated and a little bit sad to introduce you to a former student of mine who shares some of my trauma. Today, Autumn joins the show and tells us her story and how she also manages to forgive herself and not live in guilt and shame. Out of respect for your time, today's podcast is actually broken into 2 different episodes, and if you hit that subscribe button on your podcast player, her second episode will immediately follow this one. But because it is a little bit longer than our normal episodes, we have broken it into 2 so that you can listen to it at a time that is convenient for you. But make sure you hit that subscribe button so that it does download on your phone and you don't have to go looking for it. While we are highlighting Domestic Violence Awareness Month in this episode, what Autumn has for us is really for everyone, as we all deal with guilt and shame. We all struggle to forgive ourselves. But first, Autumn wanted to share part of her story and to tell us a little bit, kind of springboarding off of the last podcast, how she forgave not only herself, but those who harmed her too. So, before we drop into this conversation of this precious young lady, please remember to hit, like I said, that subscribe button, rate and review us so that we can continue to come up high in search engines and the podcast can be land and get to those people who need it. But let's drop into this conversation with her, and we'd also like to welcome a community that can now have access to these episodes in the deaf community, as Autumn, who is our guest, is translating these episodes into American Sign Language, and that can be found on our YouTube channel, which is also in the show links as well as the rest of our socials. So here we go. Let's drop into this conversation, this first part of the conversation with Autumn, as she tells us a little of her story. Hey Autumn, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It has been a while since we have, well, I saw you last week, but before that it had been a while. And so just so everybody knows, Autumn and I know each other because Autumn was a student of mine when she was a sophomore in high school. And so this is a bittersweet time for me today, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So Autumn, as we are bringing on guest of the show and as we continue to evolve as Wednesdays with Watson, we like to do a few little icebreakers. And so let me ask you a couple questions before we drop into our conversation. So we're in October in Florida, and everybody's pumpkin spicing and posting pictures of where they are, and it is approximately 185 degrees outside today. Your name is Autumn. My favorite season, if we happen to have seasons in Florida. But if you had to choose right now in a non-pandemic world where you could just do whatever you wanted, however you wanted, to go on a vacation right now, would you pick somewhere with the beach or the mountains?
Probably both. As you know, I'm a little bit more of a complex person. There's never really that black or white
right.
for me as far as that goes. But yeah, I think I'd rather have the nice mountain view and then go down the mountain to the beach. Why not have best of both worlds?
Yeah, dude, I was able to do that a couple times on a couple cruises, even horseback rode on the beach. And so, yeah, having both is legit. And we both live in Florida, so the beach is a little bit easier to get to. Now, I saw your answer to this next question. I don't even know if I want to ask you this question, but as everybody knows, I am a football fan. What is your favorite football team?
I'm a football girl too. However, I know you're a Jags fan. I'm definitely more of a Seahawks girl. I like Atlanta also, but I like me some Clemson too, which college ball. They're doing pretty well this season, if I might add.
Just a little bit. That's why I was like, I don't want to know if I want to ask you this question because, back in the day when Florida State had a team, Clemson was one of our nemesis. But yeah, I'm a Jaguars fan, and everybody just needs to pray for me at this point because wow. But well, Autumn, let's just drop right into this conversation. This is a day that is super bittersweet for me, as I mentioned, because I still remember you as that student, the one that was so full of life and innocence, and I might add here, a complete lack of interest in chemistry. I remember where you sat. I remember your smile. I remember you coming into my room, my classroom. Those were some dark days for me, and you just always were such a bright, shining star. So I hurt a little bit today because I know what you're going to tell us on this podcast, and I am grateful that you sandwich it with a whole lot of hope. I told you when you sent me what you wanted to talk about that I was going to, quote, give you the mic. And I'm pretty much going to do that, which is going to shock everybody. But let's walk through this first. So the last episode that I did was on forgiveness. And so you knew that I was going to follow the second one up, and it was also going to have a theme of forgiveness. You took it a different direction in some ways, and I know that was meant to be. But tell me why you agreed to do this, fully knowing that the subject was on forgiveness.
When you first asked me to tell my story of forgiveness, my first thought was to just go and write out this whole list of all the things that had happened to me and all the people that had hurt me, whether it was physically, emotionally, in so many other ways. And boy, it was hard to sit there and write out that list. I don't think I've ever really sat down and forced myself to recollect all the different memories of traumatic things that have ever occurred over my life's time. And quite frankly, as you've called it in some of your previous episodes, I run on cheetah mode, and I work pretty hard every day to kind of keep busy, to focus on other things, other people, and I push away those hurtful memories. So to run from them usually, and then to sit there with pen and paper in front of me and just read out each of those events in ink, just staring at me in the face, that was hard and it hurt. And I found myself needing to forgive all over again.
Yeah, you actually sent me that list and it broke my heart. But it is interesting, those last few words that you said, forgive all over again. I've gotten lots of feedback, as you can imagine, from the last podcast about how can you forgive? There's some things that are unforgivable. So I love that you use those words. Expound a little bit on that for me.
It's definitely a continuous thing. Sometimes for me, a daily thing. Most of the people who I've had to forgive, they never truly asked me for forgiveness. Actually, not one of those individuals ever came to me and said, hey, look, I'm sorry for hurting you. I'm sorry for doing those horrendous things to you. Will you forgive me? Most of them I had to choose to forgive despite that lack of apology. And things happen even now that will bring up that hurt and that anger again. And each time it feels like I'm just kind of standing there in clean clothes and someone's just splashing in this puddle in front of me. And it's like a puddle of my old mucky dirt all right there. And it just stirs everything back up again. And you can't really help but get dirty from those splashes. And that dirt, that unclean feeling, it's bothersome. It's messy. And the more and more you stand there and withstand the splashing, the dirtier you get, and it becomes more noticeable to others around you that your clothing, it's soiled. And it feels like you need to immediately run back home and change clothes. And that feeling to me, in this context, is the weight of unforgiveness. When life hits you, when your past haunts you, when you choose to carry around that weight of unforgiveness, that dirt, that really never should have probably been yours to even carry to begin with, it's noticeable and it changes you in a lot of ways. It's important when you're faced with those splashes, muddy puddles, that stirring up sometimes of just all the stuff from your past. You don't let that dirt stay on you too long, because it stains your clothes and eventually it feels like it stains your heart.
Yeah, and I think you're right about that. And it's such an interesting analogy. And it seems unfair that we have to be the ones to stay away from the dirty puddles. but we do. That's our responsibility in a lot of ways. Clearly, you've made some transactions, as we talked about last week. What are some ways that making some of those forgiveness transactions, how have you noticed that it's changed you?
The trauma of enduring things like abandonment, violence, abuse, they did definitely create post-traumatic stress disorder for me, and they changed the way that I respond to situations and also people. The choice not to forgive changed me in subtle ways, I think, externally, but big ways internally. It was this physical weight that I kind of carried around my chest. Just the breathing felt heavier, harder, and those splashes turn into what feels like smacks from the ocean's waves if you kind of just let them build long enough. And it's hard to be kind and be my happy, vibrant self when I'm combating through those waves. And I imagine I'm not very fun to be around during those moments because you act out or you entirely withdraw from people. Yeah. And sometimes you get into a cycle of this and you have to learn how to forgive and ask for forgiveness over and over, and choosing to forgive or that wanting to be clean. It's like this physical weight is lifted and you feel renewed.
My goodness, it's so true. And I know as I did that episode the last episode, that was a solo episode for me. There's a lot of those transactions still going on this many years later. It was difficult, but that is such a description of what I shared with the readers on that podcast, is why forgiveness felt so much different for me from one to the other. I shared with those listeners that my abuser died years after I left him. And what you just described is what I did not feel when I found out that he died. That weight wasn't there. I was sad. Please do not misunderstand me. And the gamut of emotions was all over the place. But I did not feel regret. I loved that you mentioned Ephesians 4:32 to me in some of our conversations, and I mentioned that in last week's podcast and talked about how compassion actually comes before some of the other things listed in that verse. But talk to me about your take on that verse and how the application of it helped transform you.
Yes, in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32, the Bible says, "Instead, be kind to each other, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, just as God through Christ has forgiven you." And even if you're not someone who has a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, the golden rule, the famous golden rule, it says, "Do unto others as you would want for them to do unto you." And I know for me, when I apply it to my life, if I'm making mistakes, if I hurt somebody, I want for them to be able to forgive me, even if it's something that maybe I did unknowingly or obviously not intentionally. But if I want for them to be able to forgive me, then I have to be willing to forgive them.
Yeah, wow, that's so powerful, and that's a biblical principle. You know, I absolutely would like to really maintain that the ability to forgive other people is a fruit of being forgiven. But you have hit on something that really, really intrigues me, and it's this idea of clean. And I've been sitting with it for a while. What does that mean? You know, like I'm saying to myself, what does that mean? What is clean, and what does it have to do with forgiveness? And the context of our preparing for this is some own soul searching of mine. And so I want you to expound on it a little bit more, particularly as it pertains to domestic violence, because as survivors, and I would even go so far as to say thrivers of domestic violence, the feeling can sometimes, if we're not careful though, be one of shame. And remember, shame being I am the mistake, not I made the mistake. And yeah, like shame feels dirty. It makes you want to go hide. It makes you want to be in the dark. It just it's dirty. But expound a little bit more on this idea of clean. And because I think it's a fascinating concept when you think of forgiveness as a daily shower of sorts of all of those things that we need to forgive.
Yes, and who likes dirty clothing? I don't like my clothes to be dirty. I don't like people staring at stains. I always get paranoid that they're looking at them or something. So I certainly don't want those stains to sit there long and then soak into your heart, as I had mentioned before. When your heart gets like that and soiled, it's a breeding ground for bitterness. So a lot of times, like I said, you run home, you want to get rid of those dirty clothes, you want to take them off, wash them, put on a fresh set of clothes. It's hard when you're hurt by others and you often want to do one thing, but then you find yourself in this place where you just have to run to the feet of Jesus. And I know for me, I have to do that, and I have to give him all of those hurts. And I have to say, Lord, take these. Please clean these soiled clothing. I know that they're messy. I know I'm messy. They may or may not be from my own doing. It might be hurt that other people have caused me, but I need you, Lord, to take these and to clean these, to make them new. And I need you to forgive me and help me forgive those, just as he's forgiven us time and time again.
Yeah. And like we just kind of said, like the ability to forgive somebody is often the fruit of being forgiven. And I have found that he has the best washer and dryer for those clothes we wear, those of shame, those of hurt, those of resentment, those of bitterness. And Autumn, I get messages all the time from people asking me, especially after this last podcast, how I could forgive, even calling some things unforgivable, even friends of mine that know what I've gone through and said that was unforgivable. And when they ask me that question, because we're talking on an episode called PTSD, Jesus and Me, so I'm not trying to hide my faith at all, and neither are you. But I really struggle when people don't share my faith, because the answer keeps coming back to the great cleaner of the dirt. As I previously mentioned, you and I share a trauma. And I want you to tell me a little bit about that. And listeners, I also want you to understand that Autumn has 3 children. And so I am allowing her as much or as little, I'm allowing her all kinds of freedom, all the freedom she wants to share as much as she feels comfortable. But when we talk about our faith and we talk about forgiveness, and even if you don't share our faith, Autumn is sharing things that also are just normal, like she said, golden rule stuff, but shame is such a part of domestic violence. And since we are highlighting this month, I want you to tell me as much as you feel comfortable of your story.
Sure. So I know a part of your story and a bullet point on your own list of traumas is the domestic violence that you endured during your marriage. I too experienced domestic violence in my marriage of over 5 years. And it's one of the things I really hate to have with you in common. However, I'm so grateful for your strength. And I did want to mention that, and your hope and your own story of continued forgiveness, because it has taught me a lot. And I'm grateful for this platform and for your podcast that has been created to give others that ability and chance to experience that hope and that strength too.
And yeah, it brings tears to my eyes to hear you say that. However, since I'm pretty sure that you didn't learn chemistry and I didn't teach it well, I'm glad that hopefully you could learn something from me now. Although, as I mentioned, it's bittersweet to have you on this podcast. I still remember you in high school, and little did I know. Like I said, you're this bright spot in my day. I can see you out of the corner of my right eye right now sitting in that chemistry lab. Little did I know, though, that you brought some trauma into that class. You know what? Let me let you tell your own story. Let me just shut up. I told you I was going to give you the mic. It's yours.
I'd like to share just a part of my personal story with you guys, and I'll try not to include too many details, but after I left my marriage, my abuser, I still had to communicate with him in some capacities because we do have children together. After I left our home, along with my children, I had to go through a very lengthy, exhausting court process to get a divorce, to gain full custody of my children. There was a restraining order that was put in place, and then eventually criminal charges that were filed against him for the just egregious things that he had done to me, to our family. During that process, several months after I had moved out of our family home that we had shared together, I was living on my own with the children. My ex-husband had forced his way into my home, and he sexually assaulted me. This took place specifically in my bedroom. And I grappled, I really did, with whether or not I should call law enforcement, as many people do not do when you're in a domestic violence situation. I had so many different reasons why I didn't want to call. Part of it was just fear that they wouldn't believe me, fear that maybe he would retaliate, my husband. or even just out of fear of what might happen to him and that unknown. There were
Right.
so many reasons.
Yeah.
But this time, my family, I had reached out to them for probably one of the first times in all of the different things that had happened to me. And they had encouraged me to call. And so I did, finally, at that time.
Yeah. And I'm so grateful. We mentioned so often, and again, shame could have stopped you from doing that and almost did stop you from doing that, because a lot of people don't understand that there is sexual assault inside marriages. There is such a thing as marital rape, and there is such a thing as all of those. And so I can see why you would have all of those fears. But I do want to interject here how vital it is as we continue as one of our C's on this podcast to talk about community, as we always talk about. I know some of your family, and I'm so grateful for them and that you had the courage to tell them. I didn't have that courage, or family, but I did not have that courage like you did, and so that is just a fruit of what you talked about earlier about this desire to not be dirty and to be clean and to forgive. And so I'm learning from you today. But tell us what happened after that.
So the detectives had come out to my home, and I had to tell the story in detail. But unfortunately, it wasn't just one time. It wasn't just two times. It was, from what I remember, at least three separate times that I had to explain the events that had just happened to me. And it wasn't just verbal. I also had to write it out. And it wasn't just with my words, whether written or verbal. They also had me physically showing them different things that had happened, and placements and movements. And I don't even know really if I have the words to describe just really how that felt. But this horror had just happened. And unfortunately, it wasn't the first time that this had happened to me. And I had to relive it. And it felt like this mob of people, going back to that whole analogy of splashing. And it just felt like this mob of people just splashing in all of these puddles in front of me. And I just stood there once again, and I was frozen. And my clean clothes, they weren't clean anymore.
Yeah. And that's a terrible thing to have to go through. It's hard for me to hear. I'm guessing, I know your real clothes weren't clean. But I know that you're not just talking about that you're also talking about the uncleanliness at the hands of someone else. But continue to tell me of how that night affected you and what happened next.
Well, my heart and my body and my spirit, they were all wounded, and I was angry all over again. I was riddled with this pain from all the things that I had thought were behind me, that I had thought I had already forgiven from him, from things before him. And it wasn't just the weight of what had happened that specific day that I began to carry all over again. It was the weight of my whole entire life's journey, full of hurt and trauma, disappointment, and it just all came flooding back. And at the end of the day, as the detectives left, they took with them my clothes that I had been wearing during the assault, my bed sheets, the comforter from the bed that I had. And I just remember after all the detectives were gone, after my family that had come and checked on me, they had left, after I hung up the last call from the day, somebody's, calling, making sure that I was okay, and whether it was another detective or somebody else. And I remember at the end of the day, I had tucked my children all in bed, and I was just there, and I was staring at myself in the mirror, and I just had tears streaming down my face. And that enormous weight that was just there in the room on my shoulders. And this feeling just consumed me of, I just want clean sheets. I just want to feel clean.
Yeah, and it was something tangible that you at that point, it was like, I just want to put clean sheets on my bed in the very unlikely event that I'll sleep for the next 7 to 10 days. But this
Yes.
literally, even, it just gives me chills. This desire to be clean is universal. We all have those dark corners of our heart. And when I think of forgiveness as dirty, or unforgiveness, as dirty, it really does reframe it for me. It sends me back to that star again of the story, because he is the only one. There's this awesome song. It's an old hymn. It's There's Power in the Blood. And there's some newer versions of that song where they repeat, there's power, 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 power in the blood. But we'll talk about that a little bit more, but it just reframes it for me, and it absolutely sends me back to the star of the story. But you wanted to be clean, and so tell me what happened next. I know that you didn't make any transactions of forgiveness that night, but life went on. And so I know in that moment, you could tell me about that moment, but tell me what next?
So honestly, in that moment, no, I didn't make any type of transactions of forgiveness. That was the last thing really on my mind. But
As it should have been.
yeah, and I thought of all the other people really who had been in similar situations to mine, and I wondered if they had felt the same way, if they had these years of ongoing just weight of heaviness, whether it be unforgiveness for other people or how they were feeling in those moments of just trauma. And if they also, especially assault victims, if they had this overwhelming feeling of just wanting to be clean, a clean slate and clean sheets.
Yeah, and almost like a do-over, right? Yeah. You had mentioned to me so many years ago, and that your healing of that, which you're going to continue to talk about, it shows in your heart because in that moment you thought of other people. And I remember that 10th grade autumn because those were some dark days for me. And like I remember like little things like I wasn't supposed to be drinking caffeine, and you and Alexis, who we're going to talk about here in a few minutes, would always steal my caffeine from me. But since you told me that, so your heart, to me, it's remarkable that and that you thought of other people in that time. But this idea of being clean, and it's why I wanted you to come on during Domestic Violence Awareness Month. But I want you to keep talking because I know where you're going, and I can't wait for our listeners to hear your heart, as they're already hearing your heart, but by hearing what you're taking from that night. But it is simply extraordinary to me. And what you're gleaning with, and right now, as I'm looking at you on this Zoom meeting, which I'm trying not to do because I'll cry, you are gleaning with clean clothes. But you had to forgive somebody else to be all the way clean, to get those emotional clothes clean. Would you mind sharing with us who that person is? Well, parts of that was certainly hard for me to hear, but it is the $1,000,000 question. Who else, possibly, could she have needed to forgive? It's now time for you to hit play on part 2 of Autumn's story. It is the podcast already published, and it follows this one. Be thinking about what she had to say to us today. It is so powerful, and remembering that so much was already paid for us so that we could live a life and so that we could live it more abundantly. So often I have mentioned Hebrews 4:15, where we do not love a high priest who is unfamiliar with our sufferings. And so I can't wait for you to hear the next part of Autumn's story and the person that she forgave that changed everything for her and could also for you.